Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Selena Osuna, coordinator for the Institute for Humanities Research and assistant director of the Desert Humanities Initiative here at ASU. I want to thank you for joining us, and it's my pleasure to welcome y'all to an event we're calling Desert Water, an Interdisciplinary Discussion, where today we'll get to hear from Doctors Maria Cruz-Torres, Jason Bruner, and Serena Ferrando. Before we get started, I'll point out that you may have noticed the chat has been disabled on Zoom. Please feel free to ask questions of our speakers at any time by using the Q&A function on the bottom of the Zoom window or by commenting on the YouTube live stream. Also, a special thanks to Joe Carter of livestreamsuccess.net for providing our live stream today. The Desert Humanities Initiative is a shared endeavor to think and practice with one another in ways that honor desert places. This event in particular has a focus on the role of water in desert places, which are generally defined by their lack of precipitation. Each of today's speakers is in a different discipline from one another, and through their own explorations of desert water interrelationships, I hope we'll have a fruitful discussion about the many ways to engage the humanities to address past, presents, and futures of desert places. Our first guest speaker is Dr. Maria Cruz-Torres, and she's a sociocultural anthropologist who specializes in environmental, applied, and economic anthropology. She's an associate professor in ASU's School of Transborder Studies, a senior sustainability scientist, and an affiliated faculty member with the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes. Her areas of teaching and research are gender and globalization, gender sustainability and the environment, political ecology, women and work in the informal economic sector, impact of globalization upon local communities and households, and the environmental and social aspects of fisheries and aquaculture development. Professor Cruz-Torres' geographic areas of interest are Latin America and the Caribbean, and she collaborated in an NSF interdisciplinary transnational collaborative research project focusing on the links between human and biophysical processes in coastal marine systems in Baja California, Mexico. Currently, she's writing a book about seafood and street economies in Mexico. Cruz-Torres is the author of Lives of Dust and Water, an anthropology of change and resistance in Northwestern Mexico, and co-editor of Gender and Sustainability, Lessons from Asia and Latin America. Our second speaker is Dr. Jason Bruner, who is an associate professor of religious studies in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies at ASU. He's a historian and ethnographer whose books include Living Salvation in the East African Revival in Uganda and Imagining Persecution, Why American Christians Believe There is a Global War Against Their Faith, as well as Sonoran Water, which is recent and which he co-authored with David Blakeman. His writing and creative work have appeared in venues such as Slag Glass City, River Teeth, The Revealer, and the Oxford American. And finally, our third speaker today is Dr. Serena Ferrando, an assistant professor of environmental humanities and Italian in ASU's School of International Letters and Cultures. Her research focuses primarily on water and modern contemporary Italian poetry. Her book project, City of Water, How Poetry Shaped Milan, offers an original eco-critical cultural narrative of the relationship between poetry and nature in the city of Milan, Italy, and 3 Milanese poets. Ferrando directs a digital humanities exhibit about Milan's water canals called the Navili Project. She also studies environmental and experimental noiseescapes and offers a course titled Noisemakers, Tracing the History of Modern Music in Italy, where students build noise instruments and develop multimedia projects that utilize sound mapping to create a multisensory experience of the world. Her publications span across the fields of literature, eco-criticism, and digital humanities. And you can tell by the robust bios that we have such just an esteemed group of speakers today, and I'm so excited to hear from them. So with that, I'm going to let Professor Maria Cruz-Torres take over. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon and welcome. I would like to thank Selena Osuna and the Institute for Humanities Research at Arizona State University for the invitation to present my work today. Known locally as El Piedrón or the Big Rock, Isla de Cedros is located on the Pacific coast of Mexico, on the Pacific coast of Baja California, Mexico. Archaeological studies, such as those conducted by Professor Matthew Dolores, has shown that at the time of European contact, the island was inhabited by native Mexican peoples, the Cochimí, who for the most part were maritime hunters and gatherers. They named the island Huamalhua or Amalgua, meaning the island of fogs, or the nebulous one because of the foggy weather. The Spanish conquistador Francisco de Ulloa, who arrived in the island in 1540, renamed it as Cedros or Cedars because these trees were then abundant. Politically, Isla de Cedros is part of the municipality of Ensenada in Baja California Norte, and it is Mexico's largest island in the Pacific Ocean. The main striking features of the island are its relative isolation or insularism, its biodiversity, its rocky and dry landscape, its quietness, and its natural spring, although it rains only a few times throughout the year. And also, this is a good place also to listen to ghost stories. And since people have time and they like to talk to everybody who comes to the island, I think for me it was a really good opportunity to be able to collect a lot of the stories, a lot of the migration stories specifically, but also I heard a lot of ghost stories about the islands as well too. Water has always been at the center of the cultural and economic evolution of the island, transforming it from a small and isolated site to a thriving community. As Matthew Delores points out, and I quote, Isla Cedros has the best sources of fresh water for over 200 kilometers north or south along the coast. Since the 16th century, the island is considered as the main source of fresh water for pirates and Japanese and Russian hunters and fishers. Since the 1920s, migration from other Mexican states as the direct result of the development of a fishing industry has directly contributed to its population growth. For example, in 1950, there were 1,000 people living in the island, and in 1990, there were 5,000 people. But with the decline in fishing resources due to many factors, including overexploitation and climate change, the population decreased, and in 2010, there were only 2,000 people living in the island. Currently, almost 3,000 people call Isla de Cedros their home. I conducted anthropological ethnographic research in Isla de Cedros in 2006 as part of the project linking human and biophysical processes in coastal marine ecosystems in Baja California, funded by a grant from the National Science Foundation. My main role in the project was to contribute to the social science component and conducted interviews, for example, among family. I visited a lot of the household, a lot of the homes in the communities, doing interviews, doing participant observation, like, for example, going to many of the meetings and a lot of the celebrations, for example, taking place at the time within the community as well. So Cedros, one of the things that I learned, and I think this is something that also is a very striking characteristic of Isla de Cedros, is that it has two towns, which are very different because of the economic activities people perform. One, which is the one that I'm showing here in this slide here, it's called actually Cedros or El Pueblo, and it is where most of the people who are fishers in the community actually live. So this is one of the oldest, I would say, probably is the oldest settlement in the community. This is where you have a lot of the migration coming from other parts of Mexico because of the fishing industry. A lot of the people actually settling in this part of the town as well. Okay. It is very interesting too, one of the differences between both towns is that people in this town actually get their water from the natural spring. Okay. So you could see, the dry, how dry it looks a little bit like Arizona, at least in the area where I live here in Fountain Hills, it resembles a lot of the hills here, and but without, the ocean. So the other town is called El Morro on the southeast of the island, and it's inhabited by the workers from the salt company. This company, which is owned by the Mitsubishi Corporation, processes and exports the salt brought in from Guerrero Negro in Baja California Sur. In El Morro, people have always struggled to secure drinking water, And most recently, since November of 2016, they get it from the desalination plant built by the Mexican government. Isla de Cedros has a very rich and productive marine environment and is home to a great diversity of plants and animals, including, as you can see here, sea lions, gray whales, dolphins, giant kelp forest, cacti, elephant trees, and agave, among many, many others. Pink and green abalone and the California spiny-nosed lobster are the pillars of the fishing industry, and these resources also connect this small, desertic, and isolated island with global seafood markets in Asia, Europe, and Latin America. How do people make a living? So besides fishing and working for the salt company, people actually own small grocery stores, souvenir stores, pharmacies, and restaurants. There is also an elementary and secondary school, a small clinic, and a community center. Ecotourism is also becoming an important source of income for many families as well. I'll show you some of the slides in here so you could see. Part of the research that I did actually involved also into looking at the role of women within the seafood industry. So this is the women who are working in the abalone industry, mostly kind of sorting it and processing as well too. This is one of the community centers, and this is more like for elderly community center. She is the person who is in charge, and she does a lot of activities, especially for elderly women in the community as well. Among the celebrations, for example, Mother's Day is one of the most important celebrations, not just in Isla de Cedros, but in Mexico in general. But here, together with the Catholic Church, they usually have every year like a celebration for the women, the mothers in the community as well too. Which is important also to know, this is, since I think more recently now, I think since 2016 now, Isla de Cedros was designated a marine protected area by then Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto. Isla de Cedros, with 20 other islands, conform now what is called the Mexican Pacific Islands biosphere. This designation, although protecting a lot of the natural resources and also kind of promoting conservation, also presents a series of new challenges and opportunities. Now conservation is what determines the specific activities that can be carried out in the island. So one of the main challenges now will be to see whether or not the water, what happened with the water, both the water, the drinking water in the island, as more, people expect more tourism or the tourist industry to grow as well too. But also what will happen with the marine environment now that it is a source now of still of income for many families in the community, but also is now protected and kind of there is now a lot of more restrictions in terms of the economic activities and fishing activities that this family will be able to carry out. So in sum, I just want to point out that water has always been at the center of the development of this island. And I think you don't see that. When you get there, the first thing you notice is that's a very dry environment. You don't even know that there is water until you start asking people and kind of conducting interviews and learning more a little bit about the island. But at the same time, people think, it's like in Spanish, el agua es la fuente de vida, no? The water is the source of life. And people are always very, very conscious about both their environment, but also the water that they use on a daily basis as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Cruz-Torres. I'll throw it over to you, Dr. Bruner.
Okay. I am putting a link into the chat that everyone should be able to see if you would like to reference a few of the photographs and images that are part of this presentation. So I want to start off by, first by thanking Selena and the Desert Humanities Initiative, kind of twofold. First, they sort of provided this space for this collaboration that is kind of the basis of my invitation here, the book Sonoran Water, which I co-authored with David Blakeman, who's a photographer in the Tempe Metro Phoenix area. And then secondly, for the invitation to present here with my two wonderful co-panelists. So this project, what I'm presenting, it's the form of a book. It's got an essay that I wrote that's woven together with a few dozen of David's photographs, a selection of which you can see at the link. Some of those are sort of full color digital. The ones that are blue and white are scanned risograph prints that are part of the book. And we wanted to include both these kind of stories as well as photographic images, because I think this combination is sort of an important generative thing to reflect on what we think about when we see something, especially with a photograph. What are we being asked to give our attention to? What's in front of us? To kind of begin sort of my presentation and thinking about water and what it means to live sort of in the Metro Phoenix area now, which is kind of where this project started for both of us. I want to start with a story. So as I was working with David on this project last year and thinking and reading an enormous amount about water in Arizona, its history, the history of settlement, colonial settlement here, and more recently the sort of the urban expansion, the suburbanization of the valley, and those kinds of things, I became increasingly conscientious of my own use of water in our backyard, especially because when we bought our house, it had a grass backyard and we had kids, and so it seemed fine, and it felt increasingly sort of problematic. So over the last few months, I've been sort of transforming it into something that's closer to kind of a zero water backyard. And one piece of that is putting down a section of artificial turf. And my soon-to-be 8-year-old daughter has strong opinions about this. And in the conversation where she was complaining about what I had done to our grass and the fact that I was putting in artificial turf, she says, "I don't like things that aren't natural. And so I want our old grass back." And so then I started talking with her about sort of, well, we're in the middle of a desert, grass isn't supposed to, this kind of grass doesn't grow here. It's not, in another sense, it's not natural for this grass to be here. And I know what she was saying is that she wanted something that was organic rather than sort of plastic or synthetic. But it was sort of an illustrative of this sensibility of what is natural in the sense of what's supposed to be here, and how do those things kind of function to sort of create this sense that we can live here as if we aren't in a desert. And I think for both David and myself, we were attracted to this sort of the bizarreness or the abstraction of living in a desert metropolis, and how that term desert metropolis has somehow come to not be seen as a contradiction in terms. So some of the questions that were a part of our kind of reflections on this, our exploration of it, was, what does living like this here in Central Arizona do to us? Not sort of just us as individuals, but us as a human society, and the animals and plants and others that are here. What forms of life take shape as a result of how we live? Or maybe to put this kind of more directly in an image, how does standing on a manicured lawn fishing for Asian carp in the middle of the Sonoran Desert become natural? So there are a few themes that kind of tie some of these pieces together. And one is a sense of history or continuity. And I think this is important in a place like Phoenix, which in some ways kind of imagines itself as not having a history, or at least a very long history. right? It claims to have arisen from ash, which is where the name comes from. But the canals and the waterways are I think, one of the most obvious and important sort of survivals, to use an old anthropological term, that we can see. It's it's one of the most interesting, I think, and important fundamental pieces of something that was here before that endures amidst all of this development. Because the way that, sort of generally speaking, Phoenix approaches history is to bulldoze it to build something shinier, newer, bigger, faster. And so the old is gone, the new has come. You know, the old was dust, the new is reflective and glittering and so on. But it's that story, it's that deep narrative that the phoenix rises from the ashes, sort of from this nothingness of something that was vacant or that had once been alive but was no more, right? This is a part of the narrative that the early settlers told that kind of gave rise to the genesis of the name Phoenix. And as I was reading a few different things from Christian history about how Christians have kind of used this concept, because it ties in quite closely with the idea of resurrection. And there's a passage from an early Christian letter, probably written around the year 100, maybe in the late 90s, from an early church leader named Clement. And he is writing about how resurrection is natural. And he's sort of trying to persuade people who are thinking that this is irrational or against nature. And so he tries to search through nature for some analogies. And so he's like, well, it's like, you know, sort of there's sunrise and sunset, one day becomes another. And this is a form of resurrection that everyone sort of recognizes or participates in. And he said another example is there's this bird several hundred miles to him at the time to, I guess, east in Arabia, which after 500 years buries itself and it rots, and it's the moisture of its rotting carcass that then gives birth to the possibility of this worm, which then grows into this magnificent beast that flies westward. And he said, this is the phoenix. And so he takes this to be a true story. But in his telling of it, what I thought was so fascinating is it's not really the ashes that are the genesis of new life. It's this moisture from its rotting corpse that gives the possibility of continuity. And similarly, I think in Phoenix, the settlers told the story that this place was vacant, that there was nothing here, and therefore it was sort of appropriate to settle it. But nevertheless, the moisture is the essential continuity that allows sort of one life to become another. And this happens, this is sort of my moving into my second theme, this happens through an enormous human effort. You know, the original canals that are now hundreds of years old, spread hundreds of miles across, you know, sort of in total across the valley. And for anyone who's spent any time digging a trench the size of some of these trenches, you know, several feet deep, several feet wide, this is an enormous labor. And I think even still today, when I mean, there's this kind of magic that happens that you can just sort of walk into any restroom or kitchen and have drinkable water, and accept that as kind of inevitable, or as like your just general expectation for being a citizen of the United States or something. And the vast, ingenious, audacious infrastructure that makes that possible here has become, at least to me, who didn't grow up here, somewhat invisible, or at least taken for granted, to the point that it's accepted. It's not sort of seen as abstract or unusual or anything like that. So the fact that you've got, you know, this enormous effort of carving out the canals, not just in the valley, but also the Central Arizona Project, going all the way up to the Colorado River, the massive series of dams that are throughout the state and throughout the West. I mean, all of these are immense feats of engineering that took enormous amounts of money, of time, of effort, of people's lives. So in thinking about sort of how water affects what Phoenix itself as a city becomes, you know, this sort of the scarcity of water because we're in a desert environment, as well as its seasonal sort of abundance and the flooding. Those were the kind of the two primary logistical obstacles that that they had to overcome in order for sort of mass settlement to be possible here. And so in some sense, one can see that the development of these technologies, of more sophisticated dams, of concrete, of hydroelectricity, and the infrastructure, the sort of that brings that electricity from the dams to our east, mostly into the valley, all of that sort of becomes this apology, this explanation, this justification for colonization that's premised upon kind of the supposed invisibility or the absence that was here in terms of human settlement. And it's also premised on this idea of reclamation, which is an important word, I think, especially for thinking about, you know, water policy in the Western United States. And what happens in what's referred to in reclamation, for those who might not be aware of it, is it's this idea that you're reclaiming the desert for settlement, to make it sort of productive in a way, in terms of cash crops, citrus and cotton, kind of most famously here. But you're trying, it's the idea that you should be taking back the wilderness from the desert and turning it into something that's orderly, settled, cultivable, and so on. So you're making it sort of, quote unquote, more useful in the sense that it's capitalizable. It's sort of ultimately premised, I think, on the idea that the desert in this case is somehow partaking in a Christian notion of sinfulness, and so you have to restore it to its kind of Edenic lushness that's imagined. So the desert took kind of what was supposed to be lush about this land and using it in this particular way, in building out these massive canal systems and fertilizing it and turning it into at least in terms of the early settlers, massive farmland, that you're kind of reclaiming that original Edenic purity of the land. So the desert in this sense is something that's generally seen as in need of redemption, and in the kind of Christianized sense of that word, right? It needs, so settlement is evidence that the land has been redeemed, and development then becomes further proof of this redemption. What happens, I think, I mean, among the things that happens as a result of this is that this place, like really any place, turns into a multiplicity, because despite this kind of hegemonic set of processes that is in many cases heavily subsidized by the US federal government, it's still lived in different ways. People move through it in different ways. Animals move through it in different ways. New plants come in as a result of this. The Asian carp is brought in, for example, mostly to control the weeds that are growing within the concrete canals in the 20th century. But this multiplicity is also made by sort of attending to the stories that we tell about the place. So this means, I think, in part, that the story of exploitation or of destruction isn't the only one, but also that the story of development that we see, you know, celebrated so much here in the Valley, this idea of rising from ashes, of expansion, of growth, generally, I think, easily serves to occlude that destruction. but you can see this multiplicity. You can see it all over the place. I think one of the more interesting places visually for me is to go up into what's now Papago Park. There's kind of a saddle where one of the paths is elevated a bit. And if you go there right under, kind of at the base of some of the sandstone, massive sandstone rocks that sort of forms the eastern boundary of the Phoenix Zoo, you can see, maybe 3/4 of the valley from that point. And for much of it, you're seeing it through this tangled crisscross of electricity, of electric lines, of massive sort of electric poles. You've got a very funky sort of engineering situation there, where the Crosscut Canal brings water mostly from the Arizona Canal down to the Grand Canal. You can see Tempe Town Lake, another kind of use of water. You can see the new developments that have gone up around Tempe Town Lake. You can see the older suburbs. You can see further east. And if you look on a clear day, you can sort of see the cotton fields, way out to the east. Looking west, you can see the start of the Grand Canal. You can see downtown Phoenix and the mountains to the south and west of the city. And here you can see this complex interplay of histories, of stories, of place, where water and electricity are deeply intertwined with one another. How sort of water is needed to generate electricity, and electricity is needed to bring water down from the Colorado River, for example. You can see that infrastructure, that development kind of meeting in real time. You can see another use of water in the formation of Tempe Town Lake, which is intended to attract a different kind of development. And it has. You can see how much that's changed in just the last 5 or 10 years. And you can see these remnants of other histories. Standing in Papago, you're not far, for example, from where several dozen Nazi prisoners of war famously broke out right at the end of World War II, and with the hopes of trying to escape to Mexico. And they were, many of them were thwarted because they had expected to be able to float there on the rivers. And were sort of sorely disappointed that the rivers didn't have sufficient water. Part of that is because of the canal system and the dam system that they had helped dig out while they were imprisoned. You can see all of these sorts of layers of things kind of compressed in this one town. The ideas of development, of reclamation, of the idea of using water to take back the desert from itself. And the idea that in that sense, water only becomes useful if it's not left in the river itself, which I think is a dangerous idea. Standing here sort of on top of Papago, I sometimes sort of look out at all of this that we've made and the things that we've inherited and wonder, what of this will endure in a real way? So we end the book with the suggestion that perhaps water itself will have a kind of a final word in reclaiming the valley again for the desert and sort of pushing our audacity out of the way. And I'd like to end here with a short poem, which will perhaps transition us to the next presentation on poetry. This is titled Concrete. I heard the valley once smelled of orange blossoms back when cars towed skiers down the canals that channeled rivers into groves. The concrete walls are radiant now, but only at night, on days I don't want extra heat. It was then very early or very late when I saw them. 3 kits, perhaps, like children chasing each other across the asphalt, tumbling in the grass, hopping into the darkness, laughing. A neighbor smoking, after a day, I think, wondered what we saw because it was when things weren't merely one thing, but never come again, nevertheless. I want to tell you of the creosote after a rain. It no longer grows on my block, but I would like to remember it one day, like the laughter. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Bruner. And to end on poetry, and we'll go right into some more poetry with Dr. Ferrando. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to begin by thanking very much the Institute for Humanities Research and Selena in particular for inviting me to be part in today's desert water conversation. I am very glad to be here and in your company. So like my two wonderful fellow presenters, I was asked to prepare a 10-minute presentation about any desert water work that I may want to talk about. And as many of you know, my research focuses on water and poetry in the context of Italian literature. Particularly, I study the entanglements and intersections of water and poetry in the city of Milan. And for this reason, because I am city-oriented, I chose to read the desert part of today's event titled with the meaning of urban desert, a little bit like Jason did. And for the purpose of this conversation, I define this urban desert as a city where green areas and watery areas are typically rare, and that non-human can mainly be found in those pockets left by urban development that Satterfield and Slovich call Cinderella sites or secondhand lands. So for the next 8 or 9 minutes, I will try to explore, perhaps more in a rhapsodic way, more than in an exhaustive way, the relationship of desert and water in the context of my research on water in the city of Milan, Italy. And I will do my best to formulate a couple of considerations that I hope will lead with your help to my enlightenment. So my ultimate goal as I reflect on water and desert and our human tendency to see the world in binary oppositions is to engage with Luz Irigaray question: could we succeed in shaping a language that is not only parallel to the living, but is itself living and participates in cultivating life? And I hope that with your help and that of a couple of examples from the work of Milanese poet Daria Menikanti, we may be able to answer this question and envision together a way of moving away from the concept of Anthropocene to that of the Symbiocene, the era that, overcoming categorical oppositions, underlines the interconnectedness of all species and biological processes and life. So first of all, I want to draw attention to the similarities between Phoenix and Milan as a way to make Menikanti's work more relatable to us here today. Phoenix and Milan are both metropolises with similar population sizes. They are former watery places with residual water canals. And while they both support many projects to bridge the gaps between the city and the natural world, they have not been particularly successful at doing so. And for this reason, there is in both places, I believe, a thirst for both green and aquatic places. And in Through Vegetal Being, Irigaray describes the city as an artificially coded familial dwelling place where, exiled from nature, quote, we wander in search of ourselves, unquote. And this is the type of thirst that I think I have encountered in Phoenix and Milan as well. So the two main things that I want to think about with you are: one, multi-species cohabitation, and two, poetry as a tool to inspire and realize it. And poetry is, I believe, animated by attention to transcend the limitations of traditional language, and it points to a wider mode of communication that makes room for the other, intended as the non-human, the more than human, the dead, God. In today's environmental academic scholarship, much emphasis is placed on transcending binary oppositions. So we have us versus them, human versus non-human, desert versus water. But doing so, we sometimes end up thinking in new binary oppositions: environmentalism versus capitalism, for example, or virtuous versus bad. And so we recreate an impossible landscape that we cannot inhabit peacefully. What if, as Irigaray writes in Through Vegetal Being, the way forward were preserving the duality, but changing our way of perceiving? Poetry has been in the business of doing just that and provides a great tool with which to make our way forward and shape our future in a conscious and responsible way. And the goal is to show that humans are not at the center of the planet, but also not its enemies. A poetic approach to the world, writes Irigaray, quote, requires me to change my way of perceiving other living beings. And this, little by little, will modify my manner of seeing the world, will transform me into a human who coexists with all the elements of the environment without aiming at dominating them, unquote. And here we get to Daria Menikanti. And I am going to share a few slides here. And here we are, both Daria Menikanti and myself. Okay. So Daria Menikanti was a splendid and extremely skilled poet, active in Milan between 1964 and 1990. She died in 1995. Her poems respond to Irigary's question about changing our way of perceiving and shaping a language that participates in cultivating life. In her work, the empty space, the suspension between each line, is filled with resonant, non-human reverberations that bring us closer to the animal and vegetal life that it describes. It is a powerful reminder of the networks of codependency that sustain life on the planet. It is not an invitation to shed our humanness in order to become the other and melt into the non-human world, but to really see it, to hear it, and acknowledge it as integral to our lives. In the poem Mida, titled after King Midas, who famously turned gold to gold everything that he touched and for that reason starved to death, Menikanti addresses our human tendency to ignore our codependent relationship with the earth in the name of profit. And in its central stanza, the poem reads, "The earth wasting away under your rugs, you slowly die from opulence." In Chameleon, she senses and foregrounds the bodies and experiences of different animals, plants, and ultimately rain. She celebrates the non-human in the city, and this envelops the urban desert of Milan in the vibrant energy, compassion, concern, and respect that make it an ecosystem. And I hope here you will not mind my reading a few lines from the Italian poem while you can follow the English translation. Ma sono, oltre che me, sono sul guscio d'un fiore il mite grillo dell'estate inquilino, o sono cane, lupino che abbaia alla strada avventato ai cancelli, o lungo i cornicioni gatta, sottile, ignara di padroni, o ancora per i viali e gli alberati la pioggia calma e solenne dopo il temporale di una giornata cieca. And in her poems, the city is often described, as here in Il Duomo, in natural terms as the non-human itself finds way to infiltrate the urban fabric of Milan so that there is a mutual interpenetration of one in the other. This is how, for example, the moonlit cathedral of Milan is transfigured into, quote, almost grown on the seabed, a peaceful shrub of gray coral. Menikanti's poetry provides a really good example of how to overcome the binary oppositions that I mentioned earlier by embracing the heterogeneous elements that come together in the urban habitat and that are entangled organically. So I will stop sharing for now, and I am back. So we moderns have resisted the overlap of nature and culture, but there are signs that they in fact overlap, particularly in the city. In a short piece titled Water in the City, Bruce Allen writes, quote, urban nature not only exists, it exists as a vital part of the natural world. There is plenty of the natural world left to us to see in the city, unquote. And Vicky Kirby supports this idea of the overlap. What happens, she asks, if nature is neither lacking nor primordial, but rather a plenitude of possibilities, a cacophony of conversations? Indeed, what if it is that same force field of articulation, reinvention, and frisson that we are used to calling culture? Menikanti's poems capture the moments in which nature and culture, water and urban desert intersect and interrelate in the cacophony of Milan. One of the central themes of her entire poetic production is this type of overlap and fusion, the response of city to nature and nature's stubbornness to persist and resist in certain urban pockets. And so I would like to conclude this brief and, as I warned, rhapsodic presentation with a quote from Allen. Water binds us together as it also dissolves and mixes us with what is other than ourselves, constantly flowing, dissolving, resolving. It holds together city and soul. And poetry, I think, is the water to our desert. It dissolves and remixes us with what is other than ourselves. It can shape a language that expresses life by drawing attention to the networks of codependency that bond us to our other cohabitants and that sustain us. And in Irigaray words, poetry does not, quote, aim to translate the language of things into that of humans, but rather to stage an encounter between the two. Poetry is the empty space between words, the abyss between us and the other, the non-verbal, more than human meanings. And for this reason, poetry cultivates new ways of being with and initiates new ways of receiving that can momentarily quench our thirst for what is missing from our desert. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ferrando, and thank you all of our speakers. My brain is spinning at 1,000,000 miles a minute, and we're finally at the portion where I can ask you some questions. And for those of you watching, if you could please send in any questions you have. We have a couple of questions already from the audience, but just a reminder to send them through the Q&A, and we can get them to our speakers. I kind of, in taking up these notions of networks of codependency, like Dr. Ferrando was saying, I'd maybe like to do kind of a round robin and ask each of you to answer. It seems to me, particularly in Dr. Cruz-Torres and in Dr. Bruner's presentations, the visibility invisibility aspect that came up in both of your presentations, and I actually think in Dr. Ferrando's too, the visibility and invisibility of water, and then also of the infrastructures of water on which these networks of codependency or communities are built. I think Professor Cruz-Torres, you were doing field work with these communities, and it kind of then became apparent to you how crucial water was, of course, on a desert island, right? But I think that really, where there's water, there's communities, human, more than human. And so just if you could speak more about that, I guess we can go in the order you presented if that's easier for Zoom.
Thank you. That's a really great question, because I think, it's very interesting. As I mentioned, when you just see the island, you don't see any sources of water. But people spend a lot of time talking about water. You hear a lot of stories about water, and of people complain, for example, about the water. Water is really like a really, really important natural resource. It's something that is highly valued. You go to restaurants, people is not, they don't offer you water unless you ask for the water. People drink mostly, a lot of other things. I mean, they really save the water. I think they really want to kind of conserve the water. But also there are so many other issues too. When I was, I think more recently there has been issues with the water in terms of the infrastructure. So many people have not been able, for example, in some of the houses, to get the water, and in some cases, actually, they even had to import or bring water from Ensenada, especially drinking water as well. So it is very interesting that this is an island. It's a very contrasting island, because it's very dry. It's a desert, island kind of environment, but at the same time, it has several, spring sources of really fresh water as well too. This has always been like a constant kind of negotiation, I think, just to kind of develop the appropriate infrastructure to able to bring the water to the houses. But also at the same time, because of that infrastructure, because the island is so isolated, it's kind of hard to keep up with the infrastructure at the same time thing. The other thing I want to mention too is just, people do value. There is a lot of stories, and I didn't get to talk about these stories, but there's so many stories that had to do with the water, that had to do also with the place as an island that has a very diverse and very rich natural environment. A lot of those stories, for example, a lot of the ghost stories that I heard had to do with that, had to do with people, coming out of the ocean, for example, or creatures coming out of the ocean and kind of living or making their way through the community as well too. So I think it is real. It is, I think, what it is. I mean, for me, really, appreciated it more because I think people also teach you how to appreciate water. The kind of things they do, for example, when they, they plant, for example, some of the food they eat, which is very important too, like having like little kitchen gardens, for example, tomatoes and herbs. It is very important how they also use that water. They see water as the source of life in this very, very dry and desert island.
I was wondering if I could just take my time to ask a question myself. To Maria, could you laid out this history of the island, and it's known for its springs, right? Going back some hundreds of years, I think. So how then is like the water from the desalination plant received? Is it thought of as a different kind of water? Do they do different things with that water? Is it treated differently? Could you speak to that?
Yeah, that was one of the main issues, because as I mentioned before, the island is divided in two main towns. So the town that is kind of, especially closer to the ocean, that part of the town and the fishing town gets most of the water from the springs, from the natural springs. But the other town, who actually formed lately because of this salt company, Mitsubishi Salt Company, actually for a long time they had to struggle. So they had to really get water. They had to come to this other area, and they had to in order to be able to get the water. So they've always been very, a lot of issues, especially with drinkable water. So this desalination plant, I think it works. I don't know how people see it differently, but I'm sure it is, because I'm working in other parts of Mexico, and I think water is something that people, it is, like drinking water is the main issue. Even when you have potable water, for example, in some of the communities where I'm doing research now, people still buy like bottled water because they feel that it is healthier. And so I imagine desalination, I think that, provides the water. I'm thinking that maybe that is supposed to be, for drinking as well too, but I think most people actually use it for other things like cooking or bathing and things like that, and still buy water in some of the local stores in the community just for drinking purposes. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. Go ahead.
Thank you, Selena. I'm always thinking about the invisible water, right? Because there's just so much in these places. And so thank you so much for your reflection. And the water, maybe as an element, is invisible, but it's very culturally present, right? It resonates and reverberates all around us. And so I had actually a question for Jason, but also for Maria. So it goes back to this idea of the memory of water that we have. And so how much and in what ways does the collective memory of water support Phoenix, for example, or Milan in my case, and similar desert metropolises or islands, as in the case of Isla Cedros? And how and when do we overcome this memory of water that sustains unsustainable places and practices, so that we can, one, recognize that we do not have water any longer and have to rethink our presence in certain places, and two, take action to bring back the water in some way?
That's a great question. That's a very hard question to answer. So I'll try to be very brief. I think in thinking about invisibility, there's, I think wells have become in aquifers, especially the non-replenishable aquifers in Arizona, at least, have taken on real kind of political significance because of the role of how that water is being distributed, who's paying for the wells that are often going towards wealthier ranching families to give up their Colorado River water rights. So there's something interesting about not really being able to visibly measure how much water is there. I know that there's technology to do that, but in terms of kind of just people looking at the landscape, it's not nearly as dramatic as going up and seeing how some of these reservoirs, have catastrophically lowered, and you can physically see where these lines have been, just a few years ago. I know Mark Klett, a colleague at ASU, did a beautiful book called Drowned River. That's a magnificent kind of reflection on this issue. So I think there is something important about the visualization of what we're doing in a way that is difficult to take it for granted, because it's so rarely presented as a scarce resource here, which is bizarre to me. Right, even the recent plan that came out maybe a year or two ago, that kind of the 25-year water plan, sort of saying, we're fine, people please keep moving here because we're fine for 25 years. It's not at all clear to me what's going to happen when we get to the 20 or 25-year mark, and we've used up some of these sources that are apparently non-replenishable. So I think part of this is imagination. In terms of how we think about what we're doing. I think the two, very briefly, I think water is responsible for generating a ton of the electricity in Arizona, and a ton of the electricity is used to get water here. So if we're thinking about some very practical things, if you want to live here longer, use less water and use less electricity, or find ways to make those things renewable. I'll end my time there.
I think in my case, I think the main concern now is that with the development of the tourism industry that is growing because of ecotourism. You have a lot of nowadays tour companies in Ensenada who are now taking people to these Isla de Cedros. When I was doing research there the first time, there was only one hotel, small hotel, and and they were very conscious about, for example, using water, and like you had to ask for towels, extra towels, and stuff like that. But now I think there is another hotel too. So there are two main hotels, not very big hotels, but small hotels. And I think water is becoming a concern, because I think people worry that the water will be diverse kind of to the hotels and for the tourists, and that they will not have access, for example, to the water that they drink, to kind of not drink, but also the water they use, for example, for daily chores, for example, in the house as well too. I think that's one aspect of it. One aspect is the drinkable water, the one that, but also the other aspect is the ocean, is the marine water that surrounds, that is around the communities, and that people, that one is very highly visible for people, because they make a living. That's how they make a living. They make a living by fishing. So they are very aware, for example, of the changes like El Nino current, for example. They're looking at all these climate changes, all these variations, for example, in the water, and people get concerned about it. But people get concerned about some of these changes and how this affect, for example, their economic activities. So in this case, there is a really very important and a direct relationship between the economy and the water as well too. So people are always talking about the weather, talking about things that are happening around them, especially in the ocean, in the Pacific Ocean, how many animals they see any variations, for example, in fish or in some of the kelp forests. So they are, it's very interesting. They do have a very strong and very important local ecological knowledge that they use to their advantage to understand and to predict, for example, the weather conditions for the next year as well too. Just want to finish with that. Maybe too.
Of course, thank you. We have a couple of audience questions. One of them is pretty direct and is about Phoenix. So if any of y'all know the answer, if not, then we will refer them to resources. But this person says a more natural solution for flooding is rainwater harvesting and catchment basins, for watering native desert plants. Do you know if Phoenix has any plans to plant native plants watered with rainwater? I don't know if anyone knows the answer to that question. Jason's looking to unmute.
Watered specifically with rainwater, I don't know. It does seem to me that a number of development plans, often include native species, but they often include non-native species as well, though often ones that are reasonably, drought resistant and so on. Yeah, I'm not sure of sort of policy level rainwater reclamation plans. So that might just need to be a follow-up.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that, sharing the knowledge you do have. One of the things I find studying deserts is that almost anything in terms of, do you know this? Do you know that? Okay, so this will be our last question because we're up against the clock here. But just kind of a reflective question from the audience, really. Thinking through our relationship to water, or the relationship between deserts and water, seems to necessitate the interdisciplinary perspective seen here today. Could the panelists each reflect on how interdisciplinarity is important to understanding, as Dr. Bruner said, the multiplicity of perspectives, understandings of water, both environmental, historical, cultural. And so if, just any kind of, I guess we're in kind of final thoughts moments, but final thoughts moments on the interdisciplinarity that you incorporate when you are doing this work on water deserts, urban deserts, storytelling. Any order of you is fine.
Serena, why don't you go first?
Okay, I'll be very, very brief. My work is very transdisciplinary. My job title is also transdisciplinary, so it's inherent in what I do. And I wanted, because I saw that the question came from Liz, who's very involved with VH, I just wanted to bring this up and say that there are transdisciplinary tools that help us bring out all these meanings and these entanglements. And DH tools are really great for that because they allow us to work across mediums and also disciplines. In a way, they're similar to poetry, going back to what I said earlier, because they allow us to use nonverbal language. And so it's possible to get messages across through those tools that are analogous to those that are coming out of poetry, because they're not necessarily tied to the word, but it's sounds and it's images as well. So I guess I'll just contribute this in terms of transdisciplinarity.
I think in my case, I think when I work on this project was really very interdisciplinary project. We have biologists, we have anthropologists, we have economists, we have historians. So it was, and I think it was a challenge too. Sometimes it's a challenge working, in interdisciplinary projects, especially this one was transnational and also a very large project too. But I think we all learn from each other. And I think, I learned about, for example, like the history of the island, learning more about it, about the place where I was going to be conducting research, but also I learned about, the biological aspects of the resources that people utilize to survive on a daily basis as well too. So I think collaboration, interdisciplinary collaboration is really key to the kind of research that I do as an anthropologist. Because there's so much that we can do. I was able to do the ethnographic part, but I think in terms of timing and in terms of the knowledge and the training, I think it's really important. It was very important for me to collaborate with marine biologists, for example, oceanographers who knew a lot of the dynamics of the biology and migration patterns, for example, or some of these natural resources. And then working with people, economists, in terms of people who knew about, for example, the demographics of the island, of the other places, in terms, for example, of people who knew a little bit about also, some of the social aspects, some of the social characteristics of the place as well too, like working with sociologists also, that was really helpful. Also want to say that we have, one of the ideas that we have, one of the ideas for the project also, was to kind of put together a digital library of photographies. A lot of the photographies that we, everybody kind of collected on their own to kind of give that back to the community as well.
Actually, I'll say to the previous question, if the participant's still with us, you might look into what has been done with the Salt River the Audubon Center, because what they've done there is to kind of create this loop of water to allow the Salt River to flow there. I'm not sure that that's all rainwater or reclaimed water, but it is I think among the most interesting Phoenix city water projects, if you're thinking about this. I mean, I think working collaboratively is something that I've kind of grown into over the last year or two, with a number of different projects, not just this one, and they've all been very, very good experiences. I mean, I think most of us in the humanities are kind of trained in more or less solitary ways, and you know, now having a bit more flexibility, especially with this kind of luxury and privilege of tenure, to just sort of allow questions to move back and forth with different eyes and minds, and you know, people moving through spaces differently, and you know, and raising different issues. I mean, I think a lot of this work is not just interdisciplinary, but it needs it just needs multiple people. So it's not even just sort of one's disposition of like, oh, I'm going to be thinking about history kind of and religion and ecology or something like that, and try to keep all of that in my head at one time. But it's sort of developing a wider conversation with other people. And that just enriches the work. And so I think the more sort of one wants to be interdisciplinary, I think the more that necessitates, you know, risking collaborative projects, and seeing what comes of them.
Thank you all. I think, yes, we learn from each other. And I just want to thank everyone for sticking around. I know we went a little bit over time, but this has been fascinating for me. I hope it was for you all as well, including our panelists. I hope you learned from each other. And I just wanted to thank again Joe Carter for ensuring our live stream and Zoom webinar went smoothly. And to the audience, I really hope that you've enjoyed this discussion, and we'll seek out the Desert Humanities Initiative should you have any interests or projects that you'd like to share with our community. And with that, take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.